everybody, reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Maya talks about her, moment of obligation, where she was on a train platform in India and observed a school happening, formed a relationship with the folks running that school, and realized the budget for that school was a grand total of about $500 per year. And education was happening. And so for that small amount of money, you could have an amazing impact on a pretty large number of kids who would otherwise not be getting any education at all. I think many folks in this line of work have had similar experiences.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by John Hecklinger, President and CEO of Global Fund for Children. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to be here.
So tell us about Global Fund for Children.
Yeah, Global Fund for Children, we've been around for nearly 30 years. We'll be celebrating our 30th anniversary in 2024. And we're set up with the then radical idea that maybe philanthropy and global development would work better if you start with the ideas of the people closest to the challenges they're facing. So we, at the time, I was not with the organization. Our founder was an extraordinary young woman named Maya Ejmera, who found that there were these amazing innovators all over the world, and all they really needed was a little bit of money and some support, to get their ideas tried out. And it was a real challenge to the way things worked at the time, because clearly ideas cooked up in Washington or London or Geneva were so much better researched and planned. But meanwhile, all these amazing innovations around the world were going unexplored. Sector has really come around to this way of working. People trying to make change in the world are really focusing on investing more at the grassroots. But it's kind of hard to do if you don't already have a lot of trusted relationships and you don't know where to look. But we do. So yeah, we've been able to support 1,000+ organizations all over the world. Have driven $50+ million to these organizations. And as important as that funding is, it's also the relationships we build with these organizations, where we can actually help them with challenges they're facing that have nothing to do with money, but sometimes just, it's the right connection, the right piece of knowledge, the right, bit of expertise, the right conversation with a peer that can make all the difference.
I'm mindful about the progressive nature of the founder of the organization, and of course, back 30 some odd years ago, to think about grassroots and thinking about localized impact versus, at the federal or at an NGO level. Somehow that this notion that we know what's best for those people in those remote regions throughout the world. That's really interesting. And I wonder what specifically was her experience that helped her to realize that, it really has to be done by the local people, for the local people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Maya talks about her moment of obligation, where she was on a train platform in India and observed a school happening. Formed a relationship with the folks running that school, and realized the budget for that school was a grand total of about $500 per year. And education was happening. And so for that small amount of money, you could have an amazing impact on a pretty large number of kids who would otherwise not be getting any education at all. I think many folks in this line of work have had similar experiences. Mine was when I was a Peace Corps volunteer back in the mid-90s in the Central African Republic. I was working on a small project, trying to get a study guide together with some local professors for their students who were generally not passing the national exams in English. So we wrote a study guide. We needed $2,000. to get the study guide published. It was going to be sold in the markets, recover the money, publish it again. And then there was a series of army mutinies, which really looked more like an attempted coup. And Peace Corps was evacuated pre-internet. This is 1996. So I have no idea what happened with that. And what I've been after kind of ever since have been ways to, fix that particular problem. I mean, how to connect people with resources, with the innovators who really need it.
Yeah. And you bring up a really interesting point, is that when we think about NGOs and philanthropy and impact, oftentimes I think people on the sidelines perhaps may think that it's all about money, but it's a lot more complicated than that, right? So talk about some non-monetary aspects that you start to allude to that gets into the stitching, the really local aspects that make some of these impact and these initiatives actually come alive.
Sure. I mean, in our space, we think of it as, capacity development. That's our jargon for it. And the way that has traditionally been done has been, okay, how do we help very local NGOs become better grantees of ours? So very focused on things like financial reporting, counting metrics, and that sort of thing, all of which are important. But we have a much more tailored approach. Sure, when we work with an organization, sometimes the challenges that emerge are around, we need to get our finances out of a shoebox and into a spreadsheet. Sure, we can help with that. But what's a lot more interesting and a lot more valuable in many cases is putting organizations, together into cohorts when they're working on different aspects of a problem in a certain part of the world. They've all experienced similar things. No matter what an organization is working on anywhere in the world, there are certain challenges that come up. How do you engineer leadership succession from a very powerful founder? It's a problem in all sectors, not just ours. How do you generate enough resources, not just from funders like us, but what assets are there in the community, where you are? What sort of interesting social enterprise models can you add into your work that really fit, that can really power you up? But a lot of times it's just, as a founder of a nascent organization, tackling really, really difficult challenges that take a very long time to change. Sometimes it's just being able to talk about that. My favorite meeting of every month is a CEO circle where I get together with a dozen or so CEOs of organizations we've funded over the years, and we share frameworks that we've discovered. We share challenges. We shared intel about the pandemic and what we were doing with staff. So it's Uganda and Nigeria and Guatemala and Serbia and Hong Kong, Romania, and we're all facing the same things. And so that's a really valuable space just to be in, to share frameworks, share ideas, share, insight, and just to generally commiserate.
Absolutely. And I think that's spot on. And in terms of that brain trust, that consortia of lessons learned and best practices. Let's talk a little bit about this notion of how GFC takes kind of a venture philosophy approach to grant making. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And again, I think the area that I'm also interested in kind of covering is the fact that while many times these grassroots and the founders have the best intention in mind, they're also subject to a lot of the corruption, local corruption, as well as some of the cultural aspects that sometimes encumber their ability to really optimize and be successful.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're doing is kind of challenging the notion of how you frame risk in terms of investing at the grassroots, because sure, in all parts of the world, not everyone, is operating, with the best of intentions all the time. So the way we address that is by spending a lot of time with potential grantee partners before we, form that financial relationship. So we establish trust. And we're ultimately, our funding is flexible, but it's only done when we've been able to have enough trust in their track record, and that they trust us because it's an unusual offer that we're making them. Like, yes, we want to work with you for several years and provide you flexible funding. They say, well, okay, great. What's the catch here? And so there's corruption on the pretend funding side as well that some of our partners are exposed to every now and then. But what we found is that what's riskier, sending several $1 billion through one organization or sending several $1 billion through 1 million organizations. The risk of loss when you're making $15,000 grants on average per year, we're not taking huge risks. We're taking small, smart risks with potentially high, social return. The parallels with, venture capital world are pretty obvious.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. There's definitely some similarity or overlap with micro lending, right? It's again, micro lending is to specific individuals, but oftentimes it's also done in a kind of tribal fashion. And there's a self-enforcement compliance that is culturally and at a community level kind of reinforced. So it's interesting to see how small grants has such a huge multiplying effect. And of course, we've seen lots of data around microlending as an example and the impact. Can you talk about one or two case studies where it's had profound impact relative to the amount of money that was actually, given? And again, just to keep in mind for the listeners, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable children, including those that are human trafficked, which is one of the huge, biggest issues. And I know GFC has also worked on anti-trafficking efforts as well.
Yeah, I think one pretty crisp example of that is one of our partners who I'll actually be visiting in a couple of weeks. I'm very excited about is an organization called Waves in Sierra Leone. And they had taken on the challenge. There is a law in the books that prevented girls who are pregnant from going to school. This is a very small but mighty grassroots organization that over time was able to challenge that policy and get it overturned. It wasn't a huge amount of money that they needed to do that, but they were the right people in the right place at the right time, getting the ear of the right people. And now that policy has changed. The girls have won. And so it's finding those people, deploying that capital, those resources, that support. The impact can really be emergent. We don't focus as much on sort of growth and scale as another funder might, although if you look at some of the partners we funded over time, they are a lot bigger than we are at this point. Organization called Magic Bus in India, for example. Enormous organization, scaling by working with government and funders all over the world. We were one of their first funders back when it was just a concept. And mobile schools, again, delivering education, but now they do a million different things in a lot of different ways, and they've learned and grown. And we love it when organizations do go to scale. That's kind of a thrill, but sometimes they don't. They can have outsized impact, remaining really, really fit for purpose and small and agile.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, you mentioned something that's interesting. And again, this is dovetailing into climate change. When we think about things, big topics like climate change, it is not localized, it's not regional, it is global in scale. And of course, as we know, climate change impact disproportionately affects the marginalized. And of course, marginalized includes children and youth. And I wonder, there's an initiative, right? I think that started recently, the Clinton Global Initiative 2022 meeting, where the Global Fund for Children was committed to creating youth-led climate resilience fund. So I wonder how something like that could make an impact on a global scale when we're dealing with such a monstrous topic.
Yeah, and this idea grew out of a program we launched last year, which is still kind of an experiment. But like, hey, what would happen if we turned grant making power over to young people around the world? Would they make different decisions? How would those decisions work out over time? So in the past year, we've convened groups of extraordinarily tuned in, smart, motivated young leaders who designed and implemented, grant making programs, setting their own priorities for the change they wanted to fund in certain parts of the world. Really strong signal that came out of our first year of work was they're really energized around climate, which is no surprise. I mean, they have a lot. They're being handed a longer future during which they're going to have to reckon, with the effects that have already been baked in. And so what we're seeing though is that youth are working at all levels. So I was at Global Philanthropy Forum in San Francisco a couple of weeks back and met a couple of extraordinary young leaders who are advising the UN on climate. And they're talking about how the real influence, the demonstrations and the strikes and the conversations and all the advocacy they were doing had a huge impact on EU policy. And so young people can have a real impact at the policy level. And yet there are millions and millions of other young people out there who are doing all that critical local work as well, taking care of forests, just raising awareness of the issue, promoting sustainable agricultural practices at the extremely local level. So you've got youth engaged all over the world in, yes, the policy level, but also, kind of direct, adaptation, sequestration efforts as well.
And I think one of the things you mentioned is that behind the scene, the process, the methodology to select some of these youth that will participate, I believe it's called the Spark Fund.
That's right.
Is very rigorous. It's very competitive. It's almost like getting into college in a way. So these are very motivated, very smart youth that really want to make a difference. And certainly we've seen that many of the faces of climate action have been very young people. Absolutely. From Europe as well as America and other parts of the world. But there's the other component, right? So there's the climate change action portion, but there's also mental health. And I wonder, the mental health became an important topic because of COVID, or was that something even important before COVID because of the fact that they're inheriting Earth with maybe a little bit less than they would have liked?
Yeah, mental health was certainly a really strong signal that came out of the first year of the Spark Fund as well. And sure, I think the mental health issues we're seeing all over the world is certainly accelerated by the pandemic. A lot of their energy was around the LGBTQ plus community and mental health young members of those communities, especially in parts of the world where, there's less understanding and acceptance, and the pressures are really more direct and acute than they might be even here in the U.S., where it's still difficult. And so that emerged as a big issue. I think there's also, kind of just a general anxiety about, the world they're being handed. When you look at some of the big trends, like climate change, being one major one that is affecting more and more young people more and more acutely every single day. But also, being really nervous about the rise of governments that are not tolerant, that are not allowing the voice of youth to be heard, or if they're not listening. There's also a component of technology sort of accelerating and exacerbating some of those anxieties that, one bad interaction can really spiral into something that is following you, not just from the school and the playground, but wherever you have your device. And those are patterns we're seeing all over. So youth are really concerned for each other's mental health.
Well, again, I think even among youth, there's even movement towards not having children. Some choose not to get married and make sure that there isn't a generation two after them. But you bring up a really interesting topic, which is getting into religion, politics, policies, and even autocrats and dictators. So Arab Spring, if you think about the movement, it was really the young people. The movement in Iran, though it's predominantly women, it's also youth-led as well. And certainly at the time of this recording, shortly after the midterm elections, we've seen certain results because of the fact that there's been an overturn of Roe versus Wade, which is not only affecting women, but also youth, people that are young, is maybe still in school or just starting out their career and want to have control over their life and their trajectory. These things are very important. And I wonder, how do you navigate some of these things when it starts to collide with regimes, state actor policies and frameworks, as well as things that's just disallowed? Like in Russia, I know they're very intolerant of the LGBTQT plus, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the big anxieties in philanthropy and global development is the kind of shrinking space for civil society to kind of operate, and it's very intentional. Certain countries really trying to silence civil society, which manifests in a lot of different ways, from just cutting off funding to actually throwing people in jail. So the key thing for us is to work within those constraints to find ways to safely, responsibly support people and organizations who are working for positive change, and help them navigate some of those complexities, which vary widely from place to place. And I think one of the things we funders agonize over a lot is, well, funding at the grassroots, these groups, I mean, it's so risky for us. Like, well, that's actually a heck of a lot more risky for them. They're putting, in many cases, their lives, families, livelihoods on the line for the change they're trying to make. And compared with, oh, that grant went south on me. We can't afford not to rethink, who's really taking the important risk here.
It's interesting. I think the way we're framing the GFC, it's much more profound than I think most people would have imagined in terms of the kind of impact and effect that we're having across the world. Going back to the Spark Fund a little bit more, can you give us a little bit more kind of practical framework around how is that fund structure for those that are interested in participating either as a youth or those that are interested in receiving grants or funding from that? What are some of the criteria, and what are some of the projects that are coming down the pipeline as a result?
Yeah, so the first year, I just want to pull up a note here. So the first year of the Spark Fund happened in 4 regions. It was the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. And so in each region had its own round of grant making. So we recruited, first in Europe for young people to become a part of this fund. And there's an application process. And these are not young people whose time we are, asking for free. There's compensation. And once convened and selected, went through a pretty intensive, orientation, relationship building kind of training process, facilitated by GFC staff, where they discovered a lot about each other, what issues they cared about, and then would set up a framework for organizations in that region to then apply for these funds. And the young people were free to kind of tune the application process to try to elicit applications in certain geographic areas or thematic areas. Once those applications were received, it's a tech platform that is meant to make it easy for young people to kind of plug in on their own time, review the applications, upvote and downvote them, and ultimately to reach some digital consensus before then having some pretty in-depth conversations to make the final decisions about which organizations would get funded and how much money they would get over 2 years, also paired with capacity development support. So they're selecting a mini cohort of organizations that we're committing to fund for at least 2 years, and also providing this wraparound support.
Can you briefly talk about the governance structure? So in other words, so once there's that consensus digitally among the youth, is there a steering committee? Is there another level higher that then oversees or discusses or negotiates with the youth that have voted for a certain set of initiatives to pursue?
No. We, as the holder of the funds and the grant maker, have to go through, certain, compliance procedures to make sure that, all of the selected organizations are indeed eligible. But we're just implementing the decisions and fully investing, the youth panels, with the power to make those decisions and honoring them as best we can, unless we run into some sort of structural difficulty in actually getting the funds to one of those organizations.
It is very interesting. It's very progressive, and I'd be curious to see some longitudinal data over time in terms of their success. But again, these are very unique individuals that are going to be leaders of one way or another in their different functional areas and disciplines, regardless. So clearly, I think, hopefully they're going to be critical to making these right decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking forward to the longitudinal data as well. We're kind of in lean startup mode with this, learning as we go and tweaking a million little tweaks that we've made in the process so far. One thing we have learned, though, we went through a parallel round of selection with GFC staff, with using the Asia applicants as the test set, and we made very different decisions than the youth panel did.
Oh, interesting. That is interesting. Terrific. Any final comment before we wrap it up here?
No, Scott, really appreciate the chance to talk about our work. We've had a lot of exciting new opportunities lately, and really proud that we're listening to the youth and getting involved in this climate work, which is the first time GFC has really done this intentionally.
Amazing. So with that, I have been joined by John Hecklinger, President and CEO of Global Fund for Children. Thanks for joining today.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.